Heartbreak doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper behind a marble column, in the giggle of a woman holding a champagne flute, in the sound of a uniform button straining across a chest that was never meant to fit into someone else's idea of beautiful. Ruby Callahan had learned to survive all of it in silence. What she had not learned, not yet, was that silence has a price. And somewhere in the cold Boston rain, a bleeding stranger was about to change the entire ledger of her life. She found him behind a dumpster at 2 a.m. She had exactly $12 in her purse and a first aid kit in her cleaning cart. She used both. The next morning, a Rolls Royce Phantom pulled up to the servants' entrance of the Sterling Grand, and Boston's most feared kingpin stepped out asking for the fat Maid who saved his life. Loyalty wears a maid's uniform. Retribution arrives in a Rolls Royce. Before we go any further, if you love stories where the overlooked woman finally gets the crown she deserves, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. The Sterling Grand rose above Newbury Street like a cathedral built for the worship of money. 22 floors of Italian marble, hand-blown Venetian chandeliers, and orchids flown in weekly from Singapore. Oil heiresses paid $8,000 a night for the presidential suite. Tech billionaires kept standing reservations for the penthouse bar. And somewhere beneath all of it, in a fluorescent-lit basement that smelled of bleach and starched linen, Ruby Callahan clocked in at 10 o'clock every night to scrub their toilets and change their 1,000-thread count sheets. She was 28 years old. She had warm hazel eyes, a wild copper braid that she pinned into a low knot beneath her uniform cap, and a soft, rounded body that filled out her polyester dressed the way rivers fill out their banks, generously, unapologetically, exactly as nature intended. She was a size 20. The Sterling Grand did not stock uniforms above a size 14. So Ruby bought her own uniforms. 2 sizes too small because 2 sizes too small was all the tailor could match to the hotel's exact shade of charcoal, and she safety pinned the seams under her apron every single shift. Nobody knew. Nobody looked closely enough to know, except Preston Vance III. Preston noticed everything. Preston was 32 years old, Harvard MBA, silver spoon polished to a mirror shine, and he ran the Sterling Grand the way a colonial governor runs a plantation. He had inherited the general manager position from his uncle. He had never scrubbed a floor in his life, and he had decided, sometime in Ruby's second month of employment, that she was an insult to the hotel's aesthetic. He called her the elephant in polyester when he thought she couldn't hear. He called her worse when he was certain she could. That Tuesday evening, 40 minutes into her shift, Preston stopped her in the lobby. He did it on purpose. He did it in front of guests. He made a loud, theatrical show of inspecting her uniform, tugging at the buttons across her chest, sighing dramatically about the hotel's image, about standards, about how certain employees seemed to have forgotten that the Sterling Grand was not a place for. And here he paused for effect, comfortable fit workwear. A cluster of wealthy women near the front desk giggled behind their manicured hands. One of them, a socialite named Whitney Ashcroft in a cream Chanel suit, laughed loud enough that it carried across the marble. Ruby's face burned. Her hands trembled around the handle of her cleaning cart. She said nothing. She never said anything. She just lowered her eyes to the veined marble floor, murmured yes, sir, and walked toward the service elevator with her spine as straight as she could hold it. In the elevator, she pressed her forehead against the cold brass panel and breathed through her nose until the sting in her eyes subsided. She thought of her grandmother Nora, 76 years old, sleeping in the walk-up in Dorchester, where Ruby paid the rent and the insulin bills and the electric and the cable and the small dignities that kept an old woman feeling human. She thought of the double shift she had picked up so she could afford Nora's new orthopedic shoes. She thought of every reason she could not afford to cry, could not afford to quit, could not afford to be seen. Then the elevator doors opened onto the 12th floor, and Ruby Callahan wiped her face, gripped her cart, and got back to work. Because invisible women, she had learned, did not get to fall apart on company time. The rest of Ruby's shift passed the way every shift passed. One room at a time, one folded towel at a time, one polished mirror at a time. She scrubbed a bathtub on the 14th floor where a hedge fund manager had left broken champagne glass in the drain. She changed the sheets in a suite on the 16th where a diplomat's mistress had left lipstick on 3 pillowcases. She vacuumed a hallway carpet where a bachelor party had spilled something red and expensive. She did not think about Preston. She did not think about Whitney Ashcroft's laughter. She thought about her grandmother's medication schedule and about the sound of the last bus rolling down Boylston Street. And she worked until her back ached and her feet burned and the clock behind the housekeeping desk read 1:47 in the morning. Ruby clocked out. She pulled on her thin gray coat, the one with the frayed cuffs she kept meaning to mend, and pushed her cart into the storage bay. She waved a quiet good night to Marisol, the night porter, who waved back without looking up from her crossword. Then Ruby stepped out through the servants' entrance into the alley behind the hotel, and the cold hit her like a slap. Late October in Boston. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the cobblestones were still slick, and the wind coming off the harbor smelled of salt and diesel and rotting leaves. The alley was narrow and long, lined on both sides by industrial dumpsters and the loading docks of the boutiques on Newbury. A single sodium lamp buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sick amber light. Ruby pulled her coat tight around her body and started walking toward the mouth of the alley, toward the bus stop, toward the small warm apartment where her grandmother would already be asleep in front of the television. She was halfway down the alley when she saw him. At first her brain refused to accept the shape. A pile of clothes, she thought. A drunk. Someone's discarded coat. Then her eyes adjusted to the amber light, and she saw the pool beneath him, black and slow spreading across the cobblestones. And she saw the white of a dress shirt turned crimson from the ribs down, and she saw the tuxedo jacket crumpled beside him with a bullet hole through the lapel. And she saw his face. He was slumped against a brick wall, behind the loading dock of the jewelry boutique 2 doors down from the Sterling Grand. He was maybe 35 years old. His hair was dark and pushed back off a forehead slick with rain and sweat. His jaw was cut from granite, and his eyes, when they snapped open and locked onto her, were the most terrifyingly awake eyes Ruby had ever seen in her life. Every instinct she owned screamed at her to run. She had lived in Boston long enough. She had read enough news. She knew what happened to women who found men bleeding out in alleys behind luxury hotels at 2 in the morning. She knew about witnesses. She knew about disappeared bodies. She knew that whatever this was, it was not her business. And turning around and walking the other way was the only rational thing a woman with a grandmother to care for could possibly do. Then she saw his hand. His right hand was pressed against his ribs, clutching a bloodied handkerchief that was doing nothing. His fingers were trembling. And in that small, human tremor, Ruby Callahan saw something that overrode every rational instinct she had. She saw a man who was going to die alone behind a dumpster if nobody stopped and helped him. She saw the exact kind of dying that her grandmother, who had been a nurse in Vietnam, had spent an entire career refusing to allow. And something in Ruby's chest, something she had spent years training into silence, cracked wide open. She walked toward him, slowly, hands visible. He rasped a warning as she got closer. His voice was low and scraped raw. "Walk away, girl," he said. "You didn't see me. You don't want to be part of this. Turn around and go home." Ruby knelt down beside him. She could smell his cologne underneath the blood, something dark and expensive, cedarwood and smoke. She looked at the wound. A graze along the lower ribs, deep but not deep enough to have hit anything vital. He had lost a lot of blood, but he had lost it slowly. He was going to live if someone stopped the bleeding in the next few minutes. He was going to die if nobody did. "I've been invisible my whole life, mister," Ruby said quietly. "One more secret won't kill me. Now shut up and let me look at that." She pulled the small first aid kit from the inside pocket of her cleaning cart apron, the one she carried because she was always the one bandaging the other maid's blistered feet. Her hands were steady. Her grandmother had taught her how to clean a bullet wound before she had taught her how to ride a bike. Ruby unzipped the small nylon kit and laid it open on the wet cobblestones beside her. Saline wipes, sterile gauze, medical tape, a pair of blunt-nosed scissors, a tube of antibiotic ointment, the contents of a kit her grandmother had assembled for her the day she started at the Sterling Grand, because Nora Callahan believed that any woman who worked on her feet for a living should be prepared to save a life or bind a blister with the same set of hands. Ruby had never expected to open it for something like this, but her fingers moved on their own, threading the muscle memory her grandmother had drilled into her through a childhood of practice bandages and pretend patience on the living room couch. She looked up at the stranger. "I need to lift your shirt," she said quietly. "I need to see the whole wound. Are you going to let me do that, or are you going to fight me on it?" He watched her for a long moment. His dark eyes moved across her face the way a man reads a language he was not expecting to encounter in this part of the world. Then he nodded once, a small tight movement, and let his head fall back against the brick. Ruby peeled the ruined dress shirt away from his ribs. The graze was ugly, but she had seen worse in her grandmother's stories. The bullet had traveled along the outside of the lowest rib, opening a channel of flesh maybe 4 inches long and half an inch deep. It was bleeding steadily, but not arterially. She could work with this. She cleaned the wound with the saline wipes, moving efficiently, apologizing under her breath every time he flinched. She packed the channel with sterile gauze. She taped it closed with 3 long strips of medical tape, pressing firmly to make sure the bandage would hold under his weight when he stood. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You're going to need a real doctor," she said. "Stitches, antibiotics, probably a transfusion, depending on how much you've already lost. This is a field dressing. It'll hold for a few hours. It won't hold for a day." "I have a doctor," he said. His voice was steadier now that the bleeding had slowed. His eyes had not left her face since she started working. "What is your name?" "Ruby," she said, before she could think about whether she should give it. "Ruby," he repeated. He said it the way a man tastes a wine he was not expecting to like. "Ruby what?" "Just Ruby," she said. She began packing the kit back together, closing the zipper with hands that were, she realized with faint surprise, completely steady. "You don't need my last name. You don't need my phone number. You don't need my address. You don't owe me anything. Just don't die in an alley, mister. That's a terrible way to go, and my grandmother taught me it's a sin to let it happen if you can stop it." He watched her pack the kit. He watched her stand up. And then, in a voice that was quiet but carried the unmistakable weight of a man who was not used to asking twice, he said, "Why are you helping me?" Ruby paused. She looked down at him, at the ruined tuxedo and the bandaged ribs and the impossible, terrifying stillness of him. She thought about the truthful answer for a moment, and then she gave it, because lying to a bleeding man in an alley at 2 in the morning felt like a kind of theft. "Because you're bleeding," she said. "That's reason enough." She reached into her purse. She had exactly $12 in cash, folded into the small inner pocket where she kept her bus fare and her emergency money. She pulled it out and pressed it into his hand, closing his fingers around it. "That's for a cab," she said. "Don't take the T. Don't walk. Get somewhere safe." She unwound the wool scarf from her neck, the gray one her grandmother had knitted her for Christmas 3 years ago, and she draped it carefully over his ruined shirt front so that the blood would not show when he walked out of the alley. It was the only scarf she owned. She did not think about that. "You'll freeze," he said quietly, looking at the scarf on his chest. "I'll walk fast," she said. She turned. She started walking. She did not look back. She did not see the way he lifted his hand from the cobblestones and looked at the $12 folded in his palm, as if he had never seen money before in his life. She did not see the way his dark eyes tracked her down the length of the alley, past the dumpsters, past the sodium lamp, past the mouth of the alley, where she turned left toward the bus stop and disappeared. She did not see the black SUV that rolled quietly to a stop beside him 30 seconds after she was gone, or the 2 men in charcoal suits who lifted him gently into the back seat, or the phone call the driver made in a low voice to a woman named Dr. Ferraro, who was already awake and waiting. Ruby walked to the bus stop with her arms wrapped around her body against the cold. The last bus of the night pulled up at 2:23. She got on. She paid her fare with the emergency quarters she kept at the bottom of her purse because she had given away her bills. She sat by the window and watched the dark storefronts of Newbury Street slide past, and she wondered briefly whether the stranger had made it out of the alley. Then she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion of a double shift wash over her, and she did not think about him again until the next morning, when a Rolls Royce Phantom pulled up to the servants' entrance of the Sterling Grand, and everything she had ever known about her small, invisible life began to burn. Ruby got 3 hours of sleep. She woke at 5:30 to the sound of her grandmother coughing in the next room, made her a cup of hot lemon water, and set out her morning insulin, kissed the top of her white head, and caught the 6:15 bus back to Newbury Street. Her back ached. Her feet already hurt. She had wrapped an old flannel scarf around her neck because the gray one was gone, and she tried not to think about where the gray one might be now, tried not to think about whether the man in the alley had lived through the night. It was not her business. She had done what her grandmother had raised her to do. The rest of it belonged to God and to strangers. She was half a block from the servants' entrance when she saw the crowd. The alley behind the Sterling Grand was never crowded at 7 in the morning. The night porters had gone home. The day housekeeping shift did not clock in until 7:30. On a normal Wednesday, the only people at the servants' entrance would be Ruby herself, and maybe a delivery driver unloading linen from a laundry truck. But today the entire day shift of the housekeeping department was clustered outside the door, 20 women in charcoal polyester dresses, whispering in 3 different languages, their eyes fixed on something Ruby could not yet see because a delivery van was blocking her line of sight. Ruby slowed down. Her stomach tightened. She stepped around the delivery van, and she stopped walking, parked directly at the servants' entrance of the Sterling Grand. In the exact spot where the laundry trucks unloaded was a midnight black Rolls Royce Phantom. It was so long and so polished that it did not look like a car so much as a piece of architecture that had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. The chrome grille caught the morning sun. The rear windows were tinted, so dark they looked like black mirrors. 2 men in charcoal suits stood on either side of it, hands folded in front of them, faces as expressionless as bank vaults. Behind the Rolls, at the very edge of the crowd of maids, stood Preston Vance III. His face was the color of skim milk. His silk tie was crooked. Sweat had beaded along his hairline, even though the morning air was cold enough to see your breath in. He was tugging on the cuffs of his suit jacket the way a man tugs on a life vest. Ruby did not understand what she was seeing. She stepped forward slowly, and the tall silver-haired man on the driver's side of the Rolls turned his head, and his eyes locked onto her with a precision that told her he had been waiting for her specifically. He stepped forward. He inclined his head with the exact courtesy a butler shows to the lady of the house. "Miss Callahan," he said. His voice was low and refined and carried a faint European accent she could not place. "My name is Silvano. Mr. Marchetti requests the honor of your company for breakfast." The name landed in the alley like a stone dropped into a still pond. The whispering behind Ruby stopped. She heard one of the maids, a Portuguese woman named Ines, who had worked at the hotel for 15 years, whisper Marchetti under her breath the way a woman whispers a prayer in a church that has just caught fire. Another maid audibly stepped backward. Preston Vance made a small, involuntary sound in the back of his throat. Ruby stared at Silvano. Her mouth had gone completely dry. "I don't understand," she said. Silvano did not answer. He simply reached back and opened the rear passenger door of the Rolls Royce, and the man from the alley stepped out. He was different in the morning light. The ruined tuxedo was gone. He was wearing a fresh charcoal 3-piece suit, the kind of suit that is not bought but commissioned, cut so precisely to his frame that it moved with him like a second skin. His dark hair was combed back. His jaw was clean-shaven. He was standing carefully, favoring his right side where she had bandaged him, and his skin was still a shade paler than it should have been. But his eyes, when they found her across the sidewalk, were the same terrifyingly awake eyes from the alley, and everything in them softened the moment they landed on her face. "Ruby," he said. His voice carried the same low rasp she remembered. "You disappeared before I could thank you." Every maid in the alley turned to look at her. Preston Vance made another small sound. Ruby felt her face flush the deep red it had flushed the day before when Preston had tugged at her uniform buttons in front of Whitney Ashcroft. Except this red was not shame. This red was the red of a woman whose entire small, quiet, invisible life had just been dragged into the light. "Sir," she said carefully, "I don't. I need to work. My shift starts in 20 minutes." Dante Marchetti smiled. It was a small smile, barely a shift at the corner of his mouth, but every person in the alley felt it. "Not today, Miss Callahan," he said. "Today, you have the day off. Mr. Vance has been kind enough to arrange it for you. Isn't that right, Mr. Vance?" Preston Vance nodded, so quickly it looked like his neck might come loose. "Of course," he choked out. "Take the week. Take the month. Whatever Mr. Marchetti needs." Before we go any further, if this story is hitting you the way I hope it's hitting you, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Every single comment helps this story reach more women who need to hear it. Now let's find out what happens when Ruby Callahan gets into that Rolls Royce. Dante extended his hand toward her. It was not a demand. It was an invitation, offered with a courtesy that felt older than anything in Ruby's world. "Please," he said quietly. "Just breakfast. I owe you a conversation. Silvano will have you home whenever you wish." Ruby looked at the hand. She looked at the crowd of women watching her. She looked at Preston Vance sweating into a silk tie. She thought of her grandmother sleeping safely in the apartment in Dorchester. She thought of the $12 and the gray scarf and the man who had told her to walk away and how she had not. And she took a breath and she stepped forward and she placed her hand in Dante Marchetti's and she got into the Rolls Royce. The door closed behind her with the soft, final sound of a vault sealing shut. The inside of the Rolls Royce smelled of leather and cedarwood, and the faintest ghost of the cologne Ruby had smelled the night before in the alley. The seats were the color of cream. There was a small crystal decanter of water set into a burled walnut console between them, and Silvano was already pulling away from the curb before Ruby had finished settling her purse on her lap. Dante Marchetti did not speak for the first block. He simply watched her the way a man watches a sunrise he was not certain he would live to see. Then he reached across the console, and, with a courtesy so old-fashioned it almost hurt, he unfolded a soft cashmere throw from the seat and draped it gently over her knees. "You were cold last night," he said quietly. "You gave me your scarf. I have not forgotten." The Rolls carried them up Beacon Hill. Silvano stopped in front of a limestone building Ruby had walked past 100 times without ever knowing what was inside. The maitre d' met them at a private elevator, bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble, and rode with them in silence to the top floor. The elevator opened onto a private restaurant Ruby had only ever read about in magazines. Wall of windows. Boston Harbor stretched out beneath them like a painting. A single table set for two, fresh white orchids, real silver, warm brioche in a linen-lined basket, and no other guests. Dante had closed the entire restaurant for the morning. Ruby sat down. She tried not to tug her coat closed across her chest. She tried not to fold her hands in her lap. She tried not to shrink. And Dante Marchetti, who missed nothing, saw all of it, and his jaw tightened with something that was not aimed at her. "Ruby," he said, "look at me." She looked at him. "Why do you fold yourself smaller when you sit down?" he asked. She opened her mouth to give the easy answer, the polite answer, the answer she had given herself in 1,000 mirrors over 1,000 years. And then she looked at his eyes, and she gave him the true one instead. "Because most rooms are not built for a woman my size," she said. "And most people don't want me to take up the space I take up. So I make myself smaller. It's a habit. I've had it a long time." Dante set down his coffee cup. He leaned forward slightly, and he spoke so quietly that Ruby had to lean toward him to hear it. "You are the most magnificent woman who has walked into a room in this city in 10 years, he said. "You saved my life last night with $12 and a first aid kit and a scarf your grandmother made you. Do not shrink at my table, Ruby. Not now. Not ever. This chair was built the moment you sat down in it. Do you understand me?" She did not answer. She could not. She simply nodded once and picked up her fork, and for the first time in a very long time she ate a full breakfast in front of another human being without measuring a single bite. Over the coffee, he told her the truth. He did not soften it. He told her who he was. He told her the name of his family and what his family did in Boston and what his enemies did to men like him when the security detail was half a block behind schedule. He told her that the bullet in his ribs had come from a rival crew called the Kavanaughs, and that his own doctor had not been answering his phone, and that a stranger, a woman his world had trained him to overlook, had knelt in the rain and saved his life without asking for a single thing in return. He told her that in his world nobody ever gave without expecting. He told her that she had given him $12 she could not afford to lose, and a scarf that had been knitted by hands that loved her. He told her he had spent the entire night trying to understand what kind of woman does that, and he had come to the conclusion that he was looking at her. She blushed. She deflected. She talked about her grandmother, about Nora's diabetes, about how she wanted to go back to nursing school one day but could not afford the tuition, and could not afford to leave the hotel, and could not afford to stop working the double shifts. She talked, and Dante Marchetti listened with the intensity of a man committing every word to memory. Then she made the small mistake of mentioning Preston Vance. It slipped out, a bitter little sentence about how the hotel did not stock uniforms in her size, and how the general manager liked to inspect her buttons in the lobby in front of the guests. Dante went very, very still. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. His voice, when it came, was so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "Say his full name, Ruby." She said it. Preston Vance III. Something ancient and lethal woke up behind Dante Marchetti's eyes. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply set his coffee cup down with the exact careful precision of a man setting down a weapon. And he said, "Thank you, Ruby. Eat your breakfast. Silvano will take you home whenever you are ready." The next 36 hours became the kind of story that older women in Dorchester would tell their granddaughters for the rest of their lives. By noon, a courier arrived at Ruby's apartment with a matte black box. Inside were 7 custom-tailored uniforms in her exact size, sewn overnight by an atelier on Newberry Street, each one cut to fit her curves with dignity. Tucked into the top of the box was a handwritten note in sharp black ink. "A queen does not safety pin her armor." By 4 o'clock, her grandmother received a call from Massachusetts General Hospital. Nora Callahan had been moved to the top of the endocrinology wait list. Every outstanding medical bill had been quietly settled by an anonymous benefactor. By 7 o'clock, a letter of admission Ruby had never applied for arrived from Boston College. Tuition paid in full for 4 years. By 9 o'clock the following night, the Sterling Grand had a new owner. The buyer was a shell company owned by a shell company owned by the Marchetti Holdings Trust. Preston Vance III arrived at work Wednesday morning to find his key card deactivated and his office cleared, and he was escorted out of the building by security in front of every employee he had ever humiliated. The reckoning came on Saturday night at the Autumn Ball. Ruby arrived in a floor-length wine-red velvet gown, custom-made by the same atelier, cut to celebrate every curve of her size 20 body, with a plunging sweetheart neckline and a corseted waist, and a slit that whispered of a woman who was done apologizing. Her copper hair was swept up, emeralds at her throat and ears. She walked into the ballroom on Dante Marchetti's arm, and the string quartet did not stop playing, but the conversations did. The room turned. The room stared. And near the ice sculpture, holding a champagne flute mid-laugh, Whitney Ashcroft turned and saw Ruby, and the flute slipped a full inch in her hand. Whitney tried to recover. She said it loud enough to carry. "Oh my God," she said, "is that the fat maid in what a curtain?" The ballroom went silent. Dante Marchetti turned his head slowly. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He simply looked at Whitney Ashcroft across the marble, and he said quietly, so the entire silent ballroom could hear, "Mrs. Ashcroft, your husband's construction firm has 3 permits pending with the city. My office reviews municipal permits as a courtesy to the mayor's office. I would think very carefully about the next sentence that leaves your mouth, and I would apologize to Miss Callahan." Now, Whitney's face drained. Her champagne flute trembled. She stammered an apology so complete and so shaking that a woman near the piano actually looked away out of second-hand embarrassment. Ruby, her chin up, her spine straight, her body taking up exactly the space it had always been meant to take up, answered her with a serenity that cost her nothing. "I forgive you, Mrs. Ashcroft," she said. "I've cleaned up worse messes than you." The ballroom, quietly, then not quietly at all, broke into applause. Later that night, Dante took her out onto the terrace. The city of Boston glittered beneath them. He told her he had never in his life met a woman who did not want something from him until her. He told her he was not an easy man to love. He told her his enemies were real and his world was dangerous, and the women who were known in his world were sometimes targeted for it. He told her he was not going to ask her to be his tonight. He was going to give her a choice. The Rolls Royce that had brought her to the ball was registered in her name as of that morning. So was the brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, where her grandmother's new home health nurse would arrive Monday. So was the tuition. So was the future. All of it. Hers. No strings. She could walk away tomorrow, and he would never bother her again. Ruby looked up at him, at the terrifying, tender, ruthless man who had seen her when the entire world had trained itself to look through her. She thought of her grandmother sleeping safely tonight. She thought of the 7 uniforms folded in her closet that she would never wear again. She thought of Whitney Ashcroft's face. She thought of the bleeding stranger in the alley who had whispered walk away, and how she had stayed anyway. Dante, she said softly, stepping into him. I already chose. I chose the second I knelt down in that alley. The Rolls Royce is beautiful, but I would have stayed even if you had been nobody. He cupped her face with the same hand she had once bandaged. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he has finally come home to. Below them, Boston sparkled. Behind them, the ballroom hummed. And somewhere out at the curb, a Rolls Royce Phantom waited, no longer a symbol of his empire, but a promise of hers. Loyalty wears a maid's uniform. Retribution arrives in a Rolls Royce. And a queen is a queen whether the world sees her or not. If Ruby's story made you feel something tonight, do me one favor before you go. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from right now. Every like, every subscribe, every comment tells YouTube to send this story to another woman who has been made to feel invisible. And tonight, of all nights, let's make sure she hears it. I will see you in the next one.